welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today has long had a personal motto: to serve. For more than 10 years she's been at the helm of a global UN institution that has been at the forefront looking at agendas, concerns and issues related to children. It's an organization that has an operating budget of over $1 billion and works in more than 160 countries around the world. I'm delighted to welcome the Executive Director of UNICEF, Bellamy. In a State of the World Children report, you said that governments make informed and deliberate choices that go contrary to the interests of children. Now, that's a fairly sort of strong, emphatic statement. What prompted that?
Well, if you take a look at the state of the world's children, clearly in 2005, children are healthier, more children in school. The Convention on the Rights of the Child has taken root, but less has been accomplished over the last decade than should have been. And so why not? When we know how to keep children alive and to prevent them from dying from causes that are clearly manageable, why? And so we would argue, and I would argue, that it's a failure of leadership, or it is deliberate choices by leaders not to invest in health and education, but rather to look elsewhere, not to take the actions that need to be taken.
When you say informed and deliberate, is there a sort of specific issues that you're looking at, apart from the umbrella ideas that I think that a lot of advocates for disarmament, for example, against nuclear proliferation and what have you, will say that money that ought to go into development is going into other issues and other agendas. What the kind of informed and deliberate choices that you think are being made that affect children in particular?
Well, I'll stick on the state of the world's children. We pointed out three overarching areas. One, the fact is that 1 out of every 2 children still is born under the poverty line of their particular country. And this includes wealthier countries as well, but certainly in the poorest countries. And the measures of poverty reduction that are used are insufficient when it comes to children, because we just look at, is there economic growth in a country? Well, that's good if there is. But deprivations of shelter, of schooling, of health also rob children of their childhood. 2 and 3, in no particular order, the failure, frankly, of leadership to take on this pandemic of HIV and AIDS. And it differs from place to place in the world, but AIDS is still on the rise. It is not going down years after we know that it exists. This is a disease that has to be confronted and fought, and yet too little is still being invested. Third, and it comes back to disarmament, but the fact is war falls on children and women largely today. The victims of war are not people in uniforms for the most part. It's 90% of victims are civilian. Making a choice to put your money into weapons, making a choice to continue to go to war rather than educate your populace, that's a choice that leaders make, and an unfortunate one.
Mm-hmm. You have also argued that the state of the poverty of children has less to do with incomes than to do with the question of rights. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's not only income. It's just that income increase alone in a country does not really go through to reducing the impact of poverty on childhood. Because if income is rising, but children aren't being educated, if income's rising, but children aren't being immunized, if income's rising, but there is not access to clean water or sanitation, these are the kinds of things that go to the well-being of children and to childhood. And looking at it from a rights perspective means children shouldn't be seen as objects of charity. They should be seen as obligations of government to meet those rights. So it is approaching governments and challenging them to meet their obligations, not pleading with them to be charitable.
Mm-hmm. You have come again under some criticism personally in terms of the priorities that you've set for UNICEF in having appeared to move away from child survival issues to child rights issues. Do you see them as many of your critics do, as in opposition to each other in some ways? Obviously not, but why is it perceived as being in opposition to each other?
I absolutely do not see them as being in opposition. Indeed, child survival remains core to UNICEF's activities. If you don't survive, nothing else counts. Now, that being said, if you survive, but then you become a child laborer in hazardous work, or a child soldier, or you're trafficked, what kind of survival is that? So we don't leave survival just at being born and living, but then what happens to that child from that point on? But child rights and child survival are two of the same thing. Child survival without rights isn't very strong. Child rights without survival isn't very strong. And again, it comes back to challenging those in power, government, private sector, civil society, to meet their obligations. Governments have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. They've said the right to health, the right to education, the right not to be exploited. So challenging governments to meet that obligation is a much stronger approach to governments, to holding them accountable, than just pleading with them.
I think much of UNICEF's work is sort of in two principal areas: advocacy and hands-on, delivering on projects and interventions. We've talked about, again, going back to this informed and deliberate choices, a substantial amount of your work needs inevitably to be in the area of advocacy too, to persuade governments to act. Would that be a fair description?
Yes, it is a fair description, and indeed there are changes now going on in UNICEF, and there should be. It's fine to have a pilot project here and a pilot project there. I was in a country recently saying we have more pilots than the local airline. But it's a pilot project unless that is illustrative and then hopefully brought to scale. And it's not UNICEF that brings things to scale, it has to be the government that takes things to scale. So advocacy for us is critically important. But then again, what do we mean? Just having another meeting? Just talk, that doesn't necessarily make a difference. But being able to try and encourage and move the agenda so it goes more broadly and affects more children, that then is advocacy with results.
In a sense, it's a larger universal question, but what are the sort of resistors to advocacy for what seems so very obvious? Don't spend money on weapons, spend it on children, spend it on development, spend it on immunization, spend it on many of the things that you're campaigning for, safe drinking water, education, and what have you. What are you up against? What are the vested interests? What are the mindsets that you're working to sort of overcome?
I think it differs from place to place. In a country like India, where frankly UNICEF and the UN, and we're delighted to be here and think we've been good partners, but India can handle things very much on its own. I think India also appreciates the contributions that a UNICEF can make. But it is, again, what is the definition of advocacy? If advocacy is just let's have another meeting, or let's have another talk fest, or let's put out another brochure, advocacy has to be measured by the results, the value added. So coming at it from a results, what does one want to achieve? How can one influence in a broader way? And do it in partnership. What we do is we accompany the government. We can't lead, we can accompany. And so I don't think there are vested interests against advocacy. I think it is for us to demonstrate that advocacy can produce a difference.
Does the sort of the styles and approaches to advocacy differ from, say, a country that is democratic and one that isn't? And what strategies and devices might you use? Because many of the sort of larger agendas that you're working to further are fairly general. They're widespread. It's many groups that believe in them and support them. What is special and distinctive in UNICEF's context and in the context of countries and cultures that you're working in?
I think it does differ in the not so much in the different cultures, but very often in the form of government. I mean, a democratic form of government, again in India, I mean, certainly a robust democracy, but a robust democracy also creates challenges sometimes. Here, just the differences between trying to influence at the local level and state level and at the federal level. Whereas a government that is a more controlling, clearly the threat that empowering not only your partners in ministries, but perhaps empowering civil society through some of the advocacy can sometimes be threatening to a less democratic form of government. So you look for different ways. I think we've been successful in some cases and less successful in others. But I do think this is an area, perhaps because the issues that we are advocating upon are ones that you can bring some real passion to. It's lucky that we are a children's agency. We could be representing much more boring issues, and then that advocacy could be a lot harder to do.
But I think it's important that our viewers get a sense that even though you're working, you start off from children's issues, but you're really looking at many other issues. You're looking at issues of gender, you're looking at issues of motherhood, you're looking at issues of sanitation, so many issues, because in some ways the state of a country or a state of a society has very direct, explicit bearing on children. Where does the gray area begin and the black, or the black and white sort of?
Well, if you look at, you've got to look at the whole child. So if you look at the whole child, then you aren't just looking at the little health box. Well, no, I shouldn't say little. Health is a critical area, or the education box, or the family box, or frankly, the role of women and gender. Let's go back to the basics. Let's look at child survival. One of the measurements of child survival is the children dying before the age of 5 from preventable causes. Well, if you look at this now, in India and in fact globally, a substantial portion of that is occurring in the first month. So what does that mean? Well, that means that we need to know how better to take care of that baby, but it also means what is the state and condition of the woman as she comes into pregnancy and childbirth. So if she's anemic, if she's malnourished, if she's too young, if she's a victim of violence. So some of those issues can get to be very sensitive issues. Nevertheless, they go directly to something that everybody will say they're for, which is child survival. So you make choices, but it means if you're looking at the whole child, you have to look at society more broadly and not just have little slices.
You're watching a conversation with Carol Bellamy, Executive Director of UNICEF. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Carol Bellamy, Executive Director of UNICEF. We were talking about this sort of, the aspect of culture and sensibilities in different countries and communities. Have you been inhibited in UNICEF by, say, the changing sensibilities of donor countries? You've had the United States, which has been a principal donor to UNICEF. It has strong, passionate views. Different administrations have had strong, passionate views on issues of abortion, on issues of contraception, which are seminal in some ways to your work. I remember sort of, reading up on you that there being outrage from some of the sort of pro-life groups to your appointment. And you've been working, for some years under a Clinton administration, some years under the Bush administration, with different ideological perspectives on this. To what degree does that affect, impact the kind of decisions you're able to take? Well,
the U.S. still remains UNICEF's #1 donor, and this has been in Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. In fact, we've managed to increase the budget from the U.S. government during the Bush administration. First of all, UNICEF has nothing to do with abortion. We have policy on family planning. It's very focused on safe motherhood and good parenting, but we have nothing to do with abortion. We don't promote, we don't advocate, we don't support. What my personal views may be and what my personal activities may have been in the past is not something that I would bring, nor have I brought to UNICEF. I have to be nonpartisan and non-political or non-country political as head of UNICEF.
We tend to have an intuitive sense of the predicament of children and the crisis the children confront, and usually associated with images of poverty and deprivation. How real is that intuitive sense that we have of the predicament of children?
Well, it is real if one looks at the fact that virtually 1 out of every 2 children in the world is living in poverty. Now, the picture we shouldn't have is just of a crying child. Children are children all over the world. They laugh, they play, they run around and kick balls, they have fun, but they also live in poverty. So that picture of the child being poor is still a very valid picture in too many parts of the world. Secondly, the word you use is a very accurate one, deprivation, because for children, the lack of adequate shelter, the lack of access to clean water and sanitation, the lack of adequate access to quality schooling. These are real deprivations. They deprive children of their childhood.
You know, very often we wonder that, common sense, insight, data, the effort of initiatives such as UNICEF make it seem so obvious, of the priority, of the need to act. As someone who has spent so much, and before this, and we'll come to that in a minute, you were with the United States Peace Corps. What is the inhibitor for change? Why doesn't civil society? Why don't politicians? Why don't we act out this impulse? Why don't we act on this understanding? It seems so obvious, and yet it isn't.
Well, there has been action. I mean, let's at least put the facts where they are right now. We live in a world today where children are healthier today overall than 10 years ago. There has been a decrease in child mortality rate. Globally, about 16 or 18%. If you take out sub-Saharan Africa, where there hasn't, unfortunately, been a decrease, it's closer to 38%. More children are in school than at any time before. So there have been actions. Now, that being said, there are parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, and some parts of South Asia where the indicators for children are still very challenging. And then in other parts of the world, while the overall statistics show improvement, you've got to cut through and go to the most marginalized communities. So the issue isn't why hasn't there been action? There has. The issue is why hasn't there been more action? Let's take on the things that we can take on, and that's our challenge. We know how to reduce the number of children dying from preventable causes. Let's do it.
Well, why aren't we doing it? You've held elected office. We have a vigorous democratic process in India, and I have to confess that I have often wondered about India itself as to why many of these issues aren't significant enough in elections. Why aren't officials acting out on what seems natural and obvious? Is it human nature? Is it that once you get elected, you can't really see the crying need? If agencies and individuals with your kind of passion are going to impact change, you're going to begin to have to impact those mindsets. So what is obvious, what is possible, is done, is acted upon.
Well, let's use India. Now, it's not fair to say entirely things haven't been acted on. I mean, what's happening now? There are more resources, actually. I mean, there's a growing economy, and I must say, India is to be acknowledged for increasing the amount of resources going into the social sector, for expanding the ICDS programs. But at the same time, there's been a stalling in reducing infant and maternal mortality rates. There are still too many children who are out of school who should be in school, particularly girls, and that will make a difference. So it's not a matter of no action, it's a matter of more action. And why not? Well, it's easier to talk than to do. And sometimes the failure isn't made between how you sustain a thriving economy. Can only be done if you are prepared to invest in your human side of the economy. The two are not mutually exclusive, they are complementary. In the long run, you need workers and you need consumers, and unless you're going to invest in basic health and basic education, you're not going to get those workers or consumers.
You're watching a conversation with Carol Bellamy, Executive Director of UNICEF. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Carol Bellamy, Executive Director of UNICEF. What I was also sort of trying to understand from an expert and a veteran in the field was that, is there something more that's needed beyond intellectual understanding, beyond data, a personal passion in leadership, qualities of being able to feel other people's pain, a degree of sensitivity? Is there a lack? What is the lack that prompts action that seems obvious? What prompted you, for example? You studied law. You have the potential for a hugely successful career on Wall Street, to go on and to serve.
Well, I've been lucky enough to be both in the private and the public sector. I don't think you have to be I don't think everybody has to be a social worker. I don't think everybody has to be wandering around weeping over the condition of people. I believe everybody should be principled by something and be able to look at yourself in the mirror. I think children's issues, frankly, are still seen as soft issues rather than core issues for any political leader in particular. They're seen as soft issues, they're seen as good political issues, but then is it good politics after an election on children's issues? I think children's issues are still seen as women's issues. Well, they are women's issues, but they're men's issues as well. They're mothers' and fathers' issues. And so perhaps the challenge is also for advocacy organizations like a UNICEF to be better able to make that connection between the well-being of society and the investment in the most vulnerable of society, and that those are children.
Well, in a sense, the formal structured chapter of UNICEF is closing for you in the weeks ahead. What has been the larger sort of philosophy that has been driving and motivating you? You know, I started the program by describing you as someone committed to serving, because that's the sense I got looking at the work you've done and the several years you spent with the American Peace Corps holding elected office. Is that something, has UNICEF helped bring greater focus to it? Is this something that will carry forward from the time you retire from this job?
Well, my term at UNICEF, I'm allowed 10 years or 2 years, 2 terms, and it's coming to an end. It's been the most extraordinary adventure and wonderful 10 years of my life. I've loved every minute of it. I've worked with the most wonderful people. I believe that there is no reason that a so-called do-good organization should be any less well run than a so-called, I don't want to say a not do-good organization. But I believe we hold a public trust, particularly when one is in the kind of a business that a UNICEF is in. So I've worked hard to try and support an organization that really will be effective, that will make a difference, that does try and produce results. It doesn't mean that we have to be accountants, with little machines adding things up, but we have to get up every day and say, okay, where do we add value? What difference do we make? Has anything changed? How do we make things change? So I hold myself, and I think I've tried to hold UNICEF to a pretty high standard. I think UNICEF meets that standard.
We have sort of, we tend to have passions. People feel passionately about children, about the environment, about pets, about disarmament, about what have you. Is there a pet passion that you feel is the underlying thread in all that you might do?
I suppose my passion is whatever you do, be excellent. Do it be as excellent as you can be in it. That doesn't mean you won't fail sometimes. It doesn't mean you won't make mistakes. My view is if you don't make a mistake here and there, you're not doing anything. We're all human beings. But give it your best, and whatever you do, make a difference at whatever you're doing, and enjoy. I also think one should try not to be involved in things that you don't enjoy, because if you enjoy, you will be better at something.
Carol Bellamy, thank you very much. This has been a great privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.